Every morning at 5 o'clock, when the world was still dark and quiet, Paul Martinez walked through the empty halls of Lincoln High School. His footsteps echoed softly on the polished floors as he carried his cleaning supplies from room to room. For 15 years, this had been his routine. 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, Paul cleaned the school that educated nearly 800 teenagers. Paul was 52 years old, with graying hair and gentle brown eyes that always seemed to be observing everything around him. He wore the same navy blue uniform every day, with his name stitched in white letters above the pocket. Most people at the school knew his face, but very few knew his name. To the students hurrying between classes, he was just the janitor. To the teachers focused on their lessons, he was part of the background. But Paul didn't mind being invisible. He had learned long ago that there was dignity in honest work, and he took pride in keeping the school clean and safe for everyone who walked through its doors. He knew which water fountains leaked, which doors squeaked, and which classrooms always seemed to collect the most dust. Lincoln High School was like a second home to him. Paul had come to America from Guatemala when he was 23 years old. He arrived with nothing but hope and determination, speaking very little English and carrying only a small bag of belongings. His education back home had ended when he was 12 years old, when his family needed him to work and help put food on the table. Dreams of school and books had to wait while he helped his family survive. When Paul first arrived in Ohio, he worked several different jobs. He washed dishes in restaurants, cleaned office buildings at night, and picked crops on farms outside the city. The work was hard, but Paul never complained. He was grateful for the opportunity to build a new life in America, and he sent money back to his family in Guatemala whenever he could. After 3 years of different jobs, Paul heard about an opening for a janitor at Lincoln High School. The pay was steady, and the job came with health insurance, something that seemed like a luxury to a young man who had grown up with very little. Paul applied for the position and was hired almost immediately. The principal at the time, Mr. Johnson, liked Paul's quiet manner and strong work ethic. Paul's wife Maria had arrived in America 2 years after him. She was smart and determined, and she learned English much faster than Paul did. While Paul worked at the school, Maria took care of their 3 children, and also worked part-time at a local grocery store. She handled most of the family's interactions with teachers, doctors, and other professionals, because her English was better, and she felt more confident speaking up. The Martinez family lived in a small apartment about 10 minutes from the school. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and safe, and Paul was proud that he could provide a good home for his family. His children, Rosa, Miguel, and Sophia, were excellent students. They brought home report cards full of good grades, and their teachers always had positive things to say about them during parent conferences. Paul would attend these conferences with Maria, sitting quietly while she talked to the teachers. He understood more English than he spoke, but he often felt embarrassed about his accent and his limited vocabulary. He worried that the teachers would think less of his children if they knew how little education their father had received. So, he listened and nodded and let Maria do the talking. What nobody knew was that Paul had always loved numbers and patterns. Even as a young boy in Guatemala, before he had to leave school, he could solve math problems that confused his classmates. He saw patterns in everything around him, from the way leaves grew on trees to the rhythm of rain on the roof. Numbers made sense to him in a way that felt natural and easy. During his 15 years at Lincoln High School, Paul had developed his own quiet routine. He would start his work early in the morning, before any students or teachers arrived. He moved through the hallways like a ghost, emptying trash cans, mopping floors, and wiping down surfaces. But Paul was always listening and watching. When he cleaned the classrooms, he would glance at the whiteboards and bulletin boards. He saw the math problems that teachers wrote out for their students. He noticed the science diagrams and the history timelines. He observed the way teachers explained difficult concepts and how students struggled to understand them. The math classrooms were Paul's favorite places to clean. He would arrive early and spend a few extra minutes looking at the equations and formulas written on the boards. Sometimes he would work through the problems in his head while he swept the floor or emptied the pencil sharpener. The math always made sense to him. even when it looked complicated and confusing. Paul had taught himself to read better English by checking out books from the public library. At first, he borrowed simple children's books to help him learn new words. But gradually, he began to borrow more difficult books. He discovered that the library had many mathematics books, and he began to read them during his lunch breaks and in the evenings after work. Maria sometimes found Paul sitting at their kitchen table late at night, working through math problems from library books. She would ask him what he was doing, and he would explain that he was just keeping his mind busy. He never told her how much he understood or how easily the complex problems came to him. He didn't want her to think he was wasting time on silly dreams when he should be focused on providing for their family. The math teachers at Lincoln High School were known throughout the district for their challenging classes. The department was led by Karen Phillips, a woman with a master's degree in mathematics who demanded excellence from both her students and her colleagues. The advanced students at Lincoln High often went on to study engineering and science at top universities. Parmentier knew all of this because he paid attention to the conversations he overheard while cleaning. He knew which students were struggling and which ones were excelling. He knew which teachers were frustrated with difficult concepts and which ones were excited about new teaching methods. He absorbed it all quietly, like a sponge soaking up water. Sometimes Paul wondered what his life might have been like if he had been able to continue his education. But he tried not to spend too much time on such thoughts. He was grateful for his job, his family, and his life in America. He had work that provided for his children's future, and that was enough. At least he thought it was enough until the day when everything changed. The spring semester at Lincoln High School was always the most stressful time of year. Students were preparing for final exams, advanced placement tests, and college entrance requirements. Teachers felt the pressure to cover all their material before the state testing began in May. Everyone seemed to move a little faster through the hallways, and conversations were often about deadlines and test scores. In the mathematics department, the stress was especially high this particular week in March. Karen Phillips had been working with her team of teachers to prepare the advanced students for a national mathematics competition. The competition was known for having some of the most difficult problems that high school students could face. Schools from across the country would send their best students to compete for scholarships and recognition. Karen had been teaching mathematics for 22 years, and she had never seen a problem quite like the one that arrived in her email on Monday morning. It came from the competition organizers as a practice problem, something to help students prepare for the real test. But when Karen looked at the problem, she realized it was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The problem was written across several lines and involved multiple areas of advanced mathematics. It required knowledge of calculus, number theory, geometric proofs, and algebraic concepts that most high school students would never see. Even Karen, with her master's degree and years of experience, found herself staring at the problem with growing confusion. She printed out the problem and took it to the mathematics office where 3 other teachers were grading papers and preparing lessons. Steve Johnson, who taught advanced placement calculus, looked up when Karen walked in with a frustrated expression on her face. Steve was 38 years old and had been teaching for 12 years. He was known for his sense of humor and his ability to make difficult concepts seem easier for his students. He was also known for being competitive, and he enjoyed mathematical challenges almost as much as his students did. "What's got you looking so serious?" Steve asked, setting down his pen and stretching his arms above his head. Karen handed him the printed problem without saying a word. Steve took one look at it, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. The other 2 teachers, Linda Carter and Mark Davis, came over to see what was causing such a reaction. Linda had been teaching geometry and algebra for 15 years. She was known for her patience and her ability to explain things in different ways until every student understood. Mark was the newest member of the team, having joined Lincoln High just 3 years earlier after finishing his master's degree. He taught pre-calculus and statistics, and he was always eager to prove himself to his more experienced colleagues. The 4 teachers spent the next hour trying to work through the problem together. They filled 2 whiteboards with equations, diagrams, and attempts at solutions. They tried approaching it from different angles, breaking it down into smaller parts and looking for patterns that might give them a clue about how to proceed. The end of their planning period, they had made very little progress. They had identified some of the mathematical concepts involved, but they couldn't figure out how to put the pieces together in a way that would lead to a solution. The problem seemed to require not just knowledge of advanced mathematics, but also a kind of creative thinking that none of them could quite grasp. Karen decided to present the problem to her advanced students the next day. She wrote it carefully on the whiteboard in room 204, her advanced placement calculus classroom. When her best students arrived, she explained that this was a challenge problem from a national competition and that she wanted them to work on it as a team. The students were excited by the challenge at first. These were the same students who had been accepted to prestigious universities, who had scored perfectly on standardized tests, and who often complained that their math classes were too easy. They approached the problem with confidence and enthusiasm, but as the days passed, their confidence began to fade. Sarah Williams, who had been accepted to study engineering at a top university, spent 3 hours working on the problem at home and came back the next day with pages of calculations that led nowhere. Jason Martinez, who had won several local mathematics competitions, tried a completely different approach but also found himself stuck. Even when the students worked together in groups, sharing ideas and building on each other's work, they couldn't make significant progress. The problem remained on the whiteboard in room 204, taunting them with its complexity. Every day, students would come in and stare at it, hoping that somehow the solution would become clear. But every day, they left feeling defeated. By Friday afternoon, the problem had been on the whiteboard for 5 full days. The students had tried everything they could think of. The teachers had consulted textbooks, searched online resources, and even contacted colleagues at other schools. Nobody seemed to have any idea how to solve what everyone was starting to call the impossible problem. The stress of the week was showing on everyone. Karen had been staying late every day, trying to work through the problem on her own. She felt responsible for her students' frustration, and she was beginning to wonder if the competition organizers had made a mistake by including such a difficult problem in their practice materials. Steve was also feeling the pressure. Several of his students had asked him for help with the problem, and he hated having to admit that he was just as stuck as they were. He prided himself on being able to help his students overcome any mathematical challenge, but this problem seemed to be beyond everyone's abilities. Friday afternoon found the 4 mathematics teachers staying late again, gathered around the whiteboard in room 204. They had been working for another hour, trying yet another approach to the problem. The whiteboard was covered with equations, crossed-out attempts, and question marks where they couldn't figure out what to do next. Steve leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. "I'm starting to think this problem really is impossible," he said with a frustrated laugh. "Maybe the competition people made an error when they created it." Linda nodded in agreement. "I've never seen anything like it. It's like it requires some kind of insight that we're all missing." Karen looked at the clock on the wall and realized it was already past 5 o'clock. The school was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Most of the students and staff had gone home hours earlier. That's when they heard the familiar sound of a mop bucket rolling down the hallway outside room 204. Paul Martinez was making his evening rounds, cleaning the classrooms as he had done every day for 15 years. In a few minutes, he would knock politely on their door and ask if it was okay for him to clean their room, just as he always did when teachers were working late. Paul Martinez knocked gently on the door of room 204 and waited for permission to enter. He could see the 4 teachers through the glass window, still gathered around the whiteboard that was covered with mathematical symbols and equations. They looked tired and frustrated, the same way they had looked all week. "Come in, Paul," Karen called out, waving him into the room. "We're just about finished here." Paul pushed his cleaning cart into the classroom and began his usual routine. He emptied the trash can near Karen's desk, wiped down the tables where students had been working, and swept the floor around the chairs. The teachers continued their conversation about the problem, but their voices had lost the energy and hope they had carried earlier in the week. As Paul worked, he couldn't help but glance at the whiteboard. The problem had been there for 5 Days now, and each day he had seen it become more complicated as the teachers and students added their attempts and ideas. But Paul had been thinking about this problem since Monday, working through it quietly in his mind while he cleaned other classrooms and walked through the empty hallways. Paul had a habit that nobody knew about. Whenever he saw interesting math problems on the whiteboards, he would think about them throughout the day. While he mopped floors, he would consider different approaches. While he emptied trash cans, he would work through calculations in his head. It was like a puzzle game that helped make his work more interesting. This particular problem had caught his attention immediately. It was different from the usual homework problems and test questions he saw on the boards. It was complex and beautiful, like a piece of art made from numbers and symbols. Paul had been thinking about it all week, and he believed he understood how to solve it. Steve Johnson was gathering his papers and preparing to leave when he noticed Paul standing quietly near the whiteboard. Looking at the problem with intense concentration, Steve had been feeling frustrated and defeated all week, and seeing the janitor staring at their impossible problem suddenly struck him as funny. "Hey, Paul," Steve said with a tired laugh. "Think you can solve our impossible math problem?" "Our best students have been stumped for days." The other teachers looked up from their papers and books. Linda smiled at Steve's comment, and Mark chuckled softly. They had all been working so hard on this problem that the idea of the janitor solving it seemed amusing. It was the kind of joke that tired teachers make at the end of a long, difficult week. But Paul didn't laugh along with them. Instead, he continued to study the problem on the whiteboard, his eyes moving carefully from one part to another. He seemed to be reading through all the attempts and false starts that covered the board, understanding the different approaches that had been tried. "Paul?" Karen said gently, wondering if he had heard Steve's comment. Steve was just making a joke about the math problem. Paul turned to look at the four teachers who were all watching him with curious expressions. He had spent 15 years being invisible in this school, cleaning around conversations and activities without ever participating. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the problem itself, which had been calling to him all week. Maybe it was the tired frustration he saw in the teachers' faces. Or maybe it was simply time for Paul Martinez to step out of the shadows. "I think I can solve it," Paul said quietly, his accented English careful and precise. The room became very quiet. The teachers looked at each other, not sure if they had heard correctly. Steve's amused expression faded, and he found himself staring at Paul with surprise. "You think you can solve the math problem?" Linda asked, her voice gentle but uncertain. Paul nodded and moved closer to the whiteboard. He studied it for another minute, looking at all the work that had been done over the past 5 days. Then he looked back at the teachers who were watching him with growing curiosity. "May I try?" Paul asked, gesturing toward the whiteboard. Karen hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to embarrass Paul, but she also didn't want to hurt his feelings by saying no. The problem had defeated everyone who had attempted it, including teachers with advanced degrees and students bound for top universities. But there was something in Paul's quiet confidence that made her curious. "Of course," Karen said, handing him a marker. "Please go ahead." Paul took the marker and moved to a clean section of the whiteboard. The four teachers settled back into their chairs, watching with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They expected Paul to write a few numbers, and then realized that the problem was beyond his abilities. They were prepared to thank him for trying, and then gently explain why the problem was so difficult. But Paul surprised them from the very beginning. Instead of jumping into calculations, he started by writing out the problem in a clear, organized way. He separated the different parts and identified the mathematical concepts involved. His handwriting was neat and careful, and his approach was methodical and logical. The teachers watched with growing amazement as Paul began to work through the problem step by step. He didn't make random attempts or try approaches that had already been proven unsuccessful. Instead, he seemed to have a clear vision of how to proceed, and he moved through his solution with confidence and precision. Paul worked quietly, occasionally pausing to think, but never appearing confused or uncertain. He used techniques that the teachers recognized, but he combined them in ways that none of them had considered. His approach was elegant and efficient, cutting through the complexity that had frustrated everyone else. As Paul continued to work, the teachers found themselves leaning forward in their chairs, following his logic and beginning to understand his method. Steve pulled out a piece of paper and started checking Paul's calculations. Linda opened her textbook to verify some of the formulas Paul was using. Mark took out his calculator to confirm the numerical computations. Everything Paul wrote was correct. Every step made sense. Every calculation was accurate. The teachers watched in stunned silence as Paul methodically solved the problem that had defeated them all week. 20 minutes after he had started, Paul stepped back from the whiteboard and set down the marker. The impossible problem was solved. The solution was written clearly in Paul's careful handwriting, and it was beautiful in its simplicity and elegance. The 4 teachers stared at the whiteboard in complete silence. Karen was the first to stand up and move closer to examine Paul's work. She read through his solution carefully, checking every step and calculation. Steve, Linda, and Mark joined her at the board, all of them working to understand what Paul had accomplished. "This is correct," Karen said softly, her voice filled with amazement. "Paul, this is absolutely correct." The room remained quiet. The full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. The janitor had solved a problem that had stumped everyone else in the school. The man they had barely noticed for 15 years had just demonstrated mathematical abilities that none of them had imagined possible. The silence in room 204 stretched on for what felt like several minutes. The 4 teachers continued to stare at the whiteboard, reading through Paul's solution again and again. They checked his work from different angles, looking for any possible mistake or error. But no matter how carefully they examined it, the solution was perfect. Paul stood quietly beside his cleaning cart, watching the teachers study his work. He had spent so many years being invisible in this school that he wasn't sure how to handle being the center of attention. His hands fidgeted with the handle of his mop, and he wondered if he had made a mistake by speaking up. Finally, Karen turned away from the whiteboard and looked directly at Paul. Her expression was a mixture of amazement, confusion, and curiosity. She had been teaching mathematics for over 20 years, and she had never experienced anything like this. "Paul," she said slowly, "where did you learn to do this?" The question hung in the air between them. Steve, Linda, and Mark turned to look at Paul as well, all of them waiting for an explanation that might help them understand what had just happened. Paul looked down at his feet for a moment, then back up at the teachers who were watching him with such intense interest. He had never talked about his love of mathematics with anyone at the school. Even his wife Maria didn't fully understand how much he had taught himself over the years. "I have always liked numbers," Paul said quietly, his accented English careful and thoughtful. "Even when I was a boy in Guatemala before I had to stop going to school." Karen nodded encouragingly, wanting him to continue. The other teachers remained silent, not wanting to interrupt what might be an important explanation. "When I work here," Paul continued, "I listen to the classes. I see the problems on the boards. I think about them while I clean." He gestured toward the whiteboard with the solved problem. "I go to the library and read mathematics books. I work on problems at home in the evenings." Steve found his voice first. "You've been teaching yourself mathematics? For how long?" Paul considered the question carefully. "Since I started working here. 15 years, maybe longer. I always like to think about numbers and patterns." Linda leaned forward in her chair. "Paul, do you realize how advanced this problem is? This is college-level mathematics. Some people with mathematics degrees couldn't solve this problem." Paul shrugged slightly, a gesture that showed both modesty and uncertainty. "It made sense to me. I could see the pattern." The teachers exchanged glances with each other. They were beginning to understand that they had discovered something extraordinary. For 15 years, a mathematical genius had been working quietly in their school, cleaning their classrooms and listening to their lessons, without anyone realizing his abilities. Mark pulled out his phone and started typing quickly. "I'm looking up this problem online," he said. "I want to see if it's been solved before and how other people approached it." While Mark searched, Karen continued to ask Paul questions. She wanted to understand the extent of his mathematical knowledge and how he had developed such advanced skills without formal education. "What kinds of mathematics books do you read?" she asked. "Many different kinds," Paul replied. "Algebra, calculus, geometry. I like the books about number theory and patterns. Sometimes I read about statistics and probability." Steve was still staring at the whiteboard in disbelief. "Paul, have you ever thought about going to college? About studying mathematics formally?" Paul's expression became sad, and he shook his head slowly. "I have 3 children. I need to work to support my family. College is not possible for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Linda asked gently. "I am 52 years old. I did not finish elementary school. My English is not perfect. I am just a janitor." The words hurt Karen to hear. She could see that Paul had internalized years of being overlooked and underestimated. He genuinely believed that his circumstances made him unworthy of educational opportunities, even though he had just demonstrated abilities that most college graduates would envy. Mark looked up from his phone with an excited expression. "I found references to this problem online. It was created by a team of mathematics professors specifically for advanced graduate students. According to what I'm reading here, most graduate students need several days or even weeks to solve it, working in groups with access to research materials." The impact of this information settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Paul had solved, in 20 minutes, what graduate students needed weeks to accomplish. He had done it alone, without reference materials, using only the knowledge he had quietly accumulated over 15 years of self-study. Karen sat down heavily in her chair. "Paul, I need you to understand something. What you just did is extraordinary. This isn't just impressive for someone without formal education. This would be impressive for anyone." Paul looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether to believe her words. "I just saw the pattern. It was not so difficult for me." "But that's exactly the point," Steve said, his voice filled with excitement. "The fact that you could see the pattern, that it seemed easy to you, that shows how gifted you are." The teachers began talking among themselves, their voices overlapping, with excitement and amazement. They discussed Paul's demonstration, comparing it to the abilities of their best students and even their colleagues with advanced degrees. Paul listened quietly, still not entirely comfortable with being the focus of so much attention. After several minutes of discussion, Karen turned back to Paul. "Would you be willing to try another problem? Something else that we've been struggling with?" Paul nodded, and Karen wrote a different advanced problem on a clean section of the whiteboard. This problem involved concepts from several different areas of mathematics, and it was the kind of challenge that she typically saved for her most advanced students near the end of the school year. Once again, Paul approached the problem methodically and confidently. He worked through it step by step, his solution clear and elegant. The teachers watched in amazement as he solved this second problem even more quickly than the first one. By the time Paul finished the second problem, word had begun to spread through the school. Mark had sent a text message to his wife, who was also a teacher in the district. Linda had called her husband to tell him what was happening. Steve had posted a brief message on social media about witnessing something incredible at work. Karen realized that this discovery was going to change everything for Paul, whether he was ready for it or not. The story of the janitor who solved impossible math problems would not stay secret for long. She looked at Paul, who was quietly cleaning the markers and preparing to continue with his evening routine, and she knew that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. By Monday morning, everyone at Lincoln High School had heard the story. Students whispered about it in the hallways between classes. Teachers discussed it in the faculty lounge during their lunch breaks. Even the principal, Lisa Carter, had received several phone calls over the weekend from parents who had heard about the janitor who solved impossible math problems. Paul arrived at work that Monday at his usual time, 5 o'clock in the morning. But instead of finding empty hallways and quiet classrooms, he discovered that several teachers were already at the school, waiting to talk with him. Karen Phillips was there, along with Steve Johnson and 2 other mathematics teachers Paul had never spoken with before. They approached him carefully, not wanting to overwhelm him or make him uncomfortable. But they had spent the weekend thinking about what they had witnessed on Friday afternoon, and they all agreed that something needed to be done to help Paul develop his remarkable abilities. "Paul," Karen said gently, "we've been talking about what happened on Friday. We think there are some people you should meet." Paul set down his cleaning supplies and listened politely as Karen explained that she had contacted several people over the weekend. She had called her former professor from graduate school, a man named Dr. Robert Hayes who taught mathematics at the State University. She had also spoken with the principal about Paul's situation. Dr. Hayes had been skeptical at first when Karen described what had happened. University professors often received calls from people who thought they had discovered the next mathematical genius. But when Karen sent him photos of Paul's solutions, Dr. Hayes became very interested very quickly. "He wants to meet you," Karen told Paul. "He's driving down from the university this afternoon." Paul felt nervous about meeting a university professor. He had never even set foot on a college campus, and the idea of talking with such an educated person made him worry about his limited English and lack of formal education. But when Dr. Hayes arrived at Lincoln High School that afternoon, he turned out to be a kind and patient man in his 60s with gray hair and a gentle manner. He didn't make Paul feel stupid or out of place. Instead, he asked Paul to walk him through the solutions he had written on Friday, explaining his thinking process and his approach to the problems. Dr. Hayes listened carefully as Paul talked, asking questions that helped him understand how Paul's mind worked. After an hour of conversation, Dr. Hayes was convinced that he was talking to someone with extraordinary mathematical abilities. "Paul," Dr. Hayes said seriously, "I've been teaching mathematics for 35 years. I've worked with some very talented people. But what you've shown me today is truly exceptional." Over the next few weeks, Dr. Hayes visited Lincoln High School several more times. He brought different mathematical problems for Paul to solve, each one more challenging than the last. Paul approached each problem with the same quiet confidence and methodical thinking that had amazed the teachers that first Friday evening. Word about Paul's abilities spread beyond Lincoln High School. The local newspaper heard the story and sent a reporter to interview Paul and the teachers who had discovered his talent. The reporter was fascinated by the story of the immigrant janitor who had taught himself advanced mathematics while cleaning classrooms. The newspaper article was published on a Thursday morning, and by that afternoon, Paul's phone was ringing constantly. Television news stations wanted to interview him. Mathematics professors from other universities wanted to test his abilities. People from around the country were calling to offer encouragement and support. Paul felt overwhelmed by all the attention. He had spent 15 years being invisible, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to him. He worried about his family and whether all this publicity would affect his children at school. He also worried about his job and whether the school district would still want him to work as a janitor now that everyone knew about his mathematical abilities. But Principal Lisa Carter quickly reassured Paul that his job was safe. In fact, she and the school board were discussing ways to create new opportunities for Paul that would allow him to use his mathematical talents while still providing for his family. The most important conversation happened on a Tuesday evening. In April, Dr. Hayes came to Paul's small apartment to meet with Paul and his wife Maria. He explained that the university wanted to offer Paul a full scholarship to study mathematics. Maria translated some of the conversation for Paul, helping him understand the details of what was being offered. At first, Paul was hesitant. He was 52 years old, and the idea of becoming a college student seemed impossible. He worried about fitting in with students who were 30 years younger than him. He worried about the coursework being too difficult, even though he had already proven his mathematical abilities. But Dr. Hayes had thought about these concerns. He proposed that Paul could start by taking just 1 or 2 classes while continuing to work part-time at the school. If Paul felt comfortable and successful, he could gradually take on more coursework. The university was willing to be flexible and patient, understanding that Paul's situation was unique. Maria encouraged Paul to accept the offer. She had always known that her husband was intelligent, but she had never realized the full extent of his abilities. She wanted him to have the chance to develop his talents and pursue the education he had never been able to get as a young man. Paul's children were excited and proud when they learned about their father's opportunity. Rosa, Miguel, and Sofia had always respected their father's hard work, but now they understood that he possessed abilities that made him special in ways they had never imagined. In August, at the age of 53, Paul Martinez became the oldest freshman in the history of the State University's mathematics program. He continued to work part-time at Lincoln High School, but now he also attended calculus classes and advanced mathematics seminars. Paul's story inspired thousands of people who read about it online or saw him interviewed on television. He received letters from other immigrants who had given up on their educational dreams. He heard from older adults who thought it was too late for them to go back to school. He became a symbol of hidden potential and second chances. The teachers at Lincoln High School never forgot the Friday evening when their quiet janitor solved an impossible problem in 20 minutes. They learned to pay attention to the people around them in new ways, understanding that brilliance and talent can be found in the most unexpected places. And Paul Martinez, who had spent 15 years being invisible, discovered that it was never too late to step into the light and pursue the dreams he had carried quietly in his heart for so many years.